want to welcome our dear friends and colleagues, and we are here at the Ukrainian Catholic University. Very enthusiastic to welcome Дейва Сновдена here at the UCU, one of the co-founders or the founders of the complexity theory and Cognitive Adge company that is actually doing a number of research and activities in that field. So welcome to UKU. We're happy to have you here. Actually, we talked a little bit during the classes about the complexity and about the complex problems and issues that our society, not only in Ukraine but all over the world, are challenging. But why it's so important actually to focus on the complexity, how it can help us to meet these challenges?
I think if you want to understand anything, you actually have to take a scientific approach. And you have to have a sound knowledge of theory in order to practice under conditions of uncertainty. That's a basic principle. Complexity science really comes about originally, to some extent, from Russian mathematicians with Prigogine in Brussels, then in Austin. So it comes through chemistry to biology to economics to computer science and now to social systems. But it's still within a generation. I mean, I know several of the other founders and so on. Yeah, and it's sometimes known as the science of inherent uncertainty. So for the last 20 or 30 years, the dominant idea in government and industry has been an approach based on what's called systems thinking or systems dynamics, which has an underlying engineering metaphor. So it says we need to look at things systematically, we need to look at the system as a whole. But it still fundamentally assumes you've got what's called linear causality. You can build models, you can design systems, you can achieve results based on people sitting down and saying this is where we want to be. Complexity deals with systems which have many connections. So there are very few boundary conditions, but everything is connected with everything else, but the connections are constantly shifting. Some of the connections, you can see the impact of the connection, but you can't see what's actually causing it. And we call those dark constraints, reference to dark energy or dark matter in cosmology. So what you've got is a system which is inherently uncertain, which is constantly shifting and changing. But there are things within it you can manage. You can manage boundary conditions, you can manage catalysts, you can manage attractors. So if you know the core theory, you can start to handle the inherent uncertainty of modern society.
Actually, we are talking about like these connections. It's really important to see the different views. Like, so you're talking a lot about even not interdisciplinary but transdisciplinary approach. Yeah. So, what do you mean by that? How it's helping us to?
I think a lot of complexity again comes from things like biology or computer simulation. So the field I work in, which I term anthro-complexity, is a study of complexity in human systems. So let's take a classic example, right? You can model the way that birds fly around in the sky if you build what's called a Boyd, which follows off three rules, which is follow the next bird, match speed, avoid collision. So if you build a simulation based on that, you mimic bird flocking behavior, or murmuration, if you look at starlings. If you add another rule about the leadership swapping on a time interval, you get the V shape that geese form in the sky. So I can actually predict the entire formation of a termite nest by chemically encoded traces triggering genetically encoded rules in termites. So that's all fascinating. Yeah? And you get a lot of people who think that's enough. They think actually they can now produce a model to describe human systems. The trouble with humans is they're not ants. I keep having to explain this to people. We're not ants, we're not birds. Several reasons. First of all, we have multiple identities. So I can, if I'm wearing a Welsh rugby shirt, I'm a very different person than where I wear a dinner jacket at the opera or a tweed suit at a university. I can be a father, I can be a brother. So human beings move between identities fluidly. So we don't have single agency like an ant or a bird. Secondly, we have an ability to do things intentionally, we don't just react. It's actually quite interesting. Human beings are the only species to show altruism outside a kinship group or to sacrifice themselves for an idea. yeah, which is actually irrational and is exceptional, and you can't deal with it that way. I mean, the whole concept of martyrdom, which goes back to the early church and then manifests in terrorism as well as noble sacrifice. You put everything there. And then we have intelligence. We're able to reflect on and change our world. Yeah? And also within human intelligence, things like aesthetics, ethics, spirituality are actually key. In fact, a lot of us now coming from a scientific background would say human beings can't avoid becoming religious. And if you look at people like Richard Dawkins, I mean, from my perspective, he's created a new religion called scientism. And he's the new prophet. I mean, he manifests like an Old Testament preacher. And we know from a lot of evolutionary psychology that this concept of the abstract is key to humans. Yeah, art comes before language in human evolution. So we live in abstractions. So the sense of the other is there. Now, those three, I call them the three I's. Yeah, intelligence, intentionality, identity, make human systems radically different from termites' nests or bird flocking. And that's why we need to bring into account cognitive neuroscience, we need to bring into account anthropology, philosophy, and this is an integration of the sciences and the humanities, which is actually quite exciting.
Yeah, indeed it is. And but it's changed a little bit our perceptions about the, let's say, the global challenges to be seen. You mentioned like terrorism, climate change, other issues like the food security. So how actually this theory, this approach can help us to develop?
It makes a big difference, all right? I mean, if you look at the way, let's take climate change, because we've just launched an initiative on that. The problem with climate change at the moment is climate scientists have been saying for decades that we've got a disaster coming. And nobody's paid attention, because human beings have a short-term focus, politicians have a short-term focus. And I don't think you can blame the politicians for this, because we get the politicians we deserve by the way we vote and the way we think. So they just respond to us. So the strategy is to make it more and more scary. Now I know something about the subject, I care about the subject, but even I stopped reading some articles because it's just too depressing. 10 years till we burn. The refugee problem in Europe, when large parts of the Middle East become uninhabitable, is about to happen, all right? So these things are imminent. But the trouble is they paralyze people. And we know this from a mixture of cognitive neuroscience and complexity, is if people feel they can't do something, then they just try and ignore it. And it kind of like makes sense if you think about it. If you can't do anything, well, why? Right? So one of the things we're focused on, this comes from a key complexity principle. Systems thinking in the engineering metaphor, which dominated the last few decades, focuses on where we want to be and says, let's achieve it. And you can see that in a lot of the climate change stuff. Complexity theory basically says, actually, it's more important to know where we are and what we can do. Because the future is so uncertain, predicting the future dooms you to failure. So what we're doing, for example, is to gather this massive narrative database, and we've done a lot of work with what's called self-ethnography or distributed ethnography, which is a quantitative approach to narrative in which people interpret their own stories. So we're gathering stories from people about small things I can do locally which will make a difference. Because if we can get people to do small things which they know will make a difference, then they start to become sensitized to the bigger issue. Then they're likely to accept the sort of sacrifices we're going to have to accept to mitigate something which is now too late to stop. But unless you get, and this is a key complexity concept, unless the dispositional state is right, nothing will change. So you can't just say we want to be here unless people are disposed to be there. So that's kind of like where we focus, and that's where the science helps. The same is true in politics. I mean, the growth of populism is partly a result of commoditization. So basically, political differences started to be removed by neoliberalism. If you don't get difference in a system, the energy cost of something extreme goes down, so you get extremes of the left and right, and we all know the consequences of that. So again, the science here can help us avoid these problems. And what we're dealing with, and this is the alternative to the engineering metaphor, is an ecosystem. In an ecosystem, small things can have a rapid impact, and that can be good or bad. But you can't predict exactly what will happen. You've got to have a resilient system which can manage for emergence of phenomena.
Thank you. And even more, so you're talking about that in the unpredicted system, when you don't know exactly what are the best solutions. So sometimes this expertise of some of the experts, like of the scientists, could be that could be overqualified, they can miss something. And you mentioned in your lecture, this yesterday in your lecture, that here, if we are talking about, like on the global scale, so Latin America and Central Eastern Europe, these interesting cases, because they, the tendencies that is happening here, so you can see something that the other parts of the world missed. So what do you mean by that?
This is what we call apex predator theory. So what actually happens is that a new idea or a new movement sweeps in. It becomes highly dominant, or a company becomes dominant. So for example, IBM dominate computing for several decades. The reason they could dominate it is they were previously the world's experts in punch card technology to control sewing machines. So they repurposed that capability to give them first mover advantage in computing. And generally, repurposing what you're already good at is the best way to innovate. Yeah. But once they get there, they think they're the dominant predator. You know, they don't have to worry about price margin. Nobody gets fired for buying IBM. So they don't see that hardware is becoming a commodity until it's too late. And then they almost went bankrupt. I mean, I worked for them for 7 years. They just about recovered, but never the same level of dominance. Microsoft then took over by repurposing software that IBM had paid them to deliver to actually create Windows. And then they didn't see software becoming a commodity. And they got displaced by Apple, who basically realized it's an anthropological concept called objects of material desire, that we wanted beautiful things that did things we didn't know we needed until we had them, and now we can't do without them. And hardware and software is irrelevant. Now, in each of those cases, and you see the same when Kodak invent digital photography, but don't make the change, and they go bankrupt, right? So basically, whoever is the dominant way of thinking of the old metaphor doesn't see the change. It's what Clayton Christensen called in various guises, but I would summarize it as competence-induced failure. You don't fail because you're incompetent, you'll fail because you're too competent at the old paradigm. When the dinosaurs get wiped out by a meteor, it's not the crocodile or the shark who replaced them, it's the first mammal, because it's small and highly energy efficient. So society is going through major changes. The dominance of neoliberal politics from the English Empire and then the American Empire, which succeeded it, is based on constant permanent growth. The planet on which we live can't survive a policy based on growth. That's a death knell. We need to look at the world differently. That's at a mega level. At a micro level, we didn't evolve as isolated individuals. We operated to operate in extended families, clans, and tribes. Collective intelligence in humans is more effective than individual intelligence because it has cognitive diversity. Societies which are collectivist in nature and highly integrated are capable of achieving change, whereas societies based on individual selfishness aren't. So for my mind, at a society level, the future lies in peripheral countries. And I'm Welsh, so I'm biased on this, all right? You know, we sit on the side of the English, right? Small countries can move faster because they're better connected. Novel companies are small companies, not big companies, because they can move faster. So the opportunity during a period of phase shift or change lies on the periphery, not the center.
Good, that's quite an interesting approach to that, and I think it's definitely chances for this society who are in transition to use these transition periods and to make a difference.
We've also lived through stuff.
Yeah.
I tell my children they've had a very quiet life, right? I mean, I remember going on civil rights marches in Ireland when Catholics didn't have the vote. Yeah, I mean, we played on the street. We had to deal with whatever we did. I worked in Australia on Aboriginal land rights. I worked in Africa for the World Council of Churches. I've been on the floor with a gun in the back of my neck 3 times in my life, and I've had 3 near misses with snakes, all right? They've never had any of that experience. I mean, some of the most effective people we're working with in the UN are actually women from Eastern Europe who have been lived through hell, know how bad it could be. I was in, I forgot the name of the town, Nova something or other the other day, which was subject to a massive NATO bombardment during the Balkans War. And I suddenly realized I'm talking to an audience of people, everybody who has actually lived through their whole city being devastated. And that creates a capacity you don't have if you're comfortable. And I think this is the thing, it's to use that discomfort, that experience to advantage.
And it's also part of the experience and personal leadership, because if you're overcoming these challenges, you become a little bit more prepared.
And I think you also realize things can go wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult. One of the reasons you can't get climate change intact is people just don't know that things can go wrong. I mean, they're starting to now, because we're getting whirlwinds in the UK, massive heat waves, water shortages. You know, so now people are taking it seriously, but kind of like it's 20, 30 years too late.
So, and in terms of this experience in leadership and also understanding the right to fail and seeing fail beautiful, so you as a previous worker for a long time for the technology companies and your background there, you talked that it's really important to talk about the ethics and technologies and about the leadership there, because sometimes you're just facilitators for programming and you missed the real thing, the real design. So,
I think you have a few problems here. One is the cult of the great leader.
Yeah.
So you tend to see this in companies. It's kind of like everything is either an automated process or anything else is handled by a gifted leader making decisions, and that's kind of like crazy. So collective leadership is one of the ways we're going. So we're working with the concept of crews. So if you look at the military unit, people are trained in role and role expectation. So there's always a pilot, but who is the pilot can change. Yeah. So we're looking at new forms of highly ritualized collective leadership, which has more diversity. So that's one thing we're looking at in leadership. Yeah? The other area which is a key on this is that they have this technology concept, in that we've now got people writing computer programs who spent their entire life sitting in front of a computer screen. One of the most depressing news stories this year was this massive computer game competition with a huge amount of prize. And there were parents saying they'd actually homeschooled their kids so they could spend 14 hours training every day on a computer screen. And that to me is a profound sin in many ways, all right? Because it's destroying humanity. And you've got people who've never lived outside a computer programming environment writing algorithms which have implications for people's lives. So to my mind, there are two key things we now start to do. We shouldn't allow anybody into any software engineering role unless they've got a basic training in ethics and aesthetics. And that has to be introduced at high school and at undergraduate level, because it has to be embedded during periods of brain plasticity. It's too late to do it when you get into your 20s or 30s, because by then the patterns are formed. So ethical awareness and awareness of our planet, and actually the work of Greta Improvement is making a difference. You know, school kids today, when we've been interviewed, are out on strike because it's their future. And they're starting to think about ethics. They're starting to think about things, you know, about the planet. We need software engineers doing that from that age. And we need to do some very fast retrofitting in terms of ethical controls. Otherwise, the AI is going to get out of hand. I was part of a think tank in the States a couple of years back. And in terms of existential threats, we went nuclear war, which is more scary than it was even in the 50s at the moment, particularly with things like neutron bombs. Then we went AI, then gene splicing, and then global warming. And that was a major group, all right? Now, if you think about that, that's got major implications. AI is actually very, very scary, because it's not that it can replace humans in intelligence, but it can create a type of swarm intelligence which human beings can't compete with.
Thank you for that. And this is actually what we are doing here at the UCU with our values-based approach to education and to the presenting ethics in the number of the study programs that we are doing here. So you are here for a few days, and you probably see some parts of what we're doing here, and you witness a little bit our community life and our approach to that. And UCU is not so big university, but we are trying to impact, like to make a difference in the different field. So what should we do in terms of the complexity theory? How can we bring more ethical thinking to the at least Ukrainian society?
I mean, it's been a highly enjoyable couple of days, all right? And there's been some really good audiences. because I haven't compromised on the intellectual content of this and they've survived. So I'm impressed on that alone, right? I think there are several things, and we just came out of a meeting talking about this. We're running a big international project at the moment, which is looking at the role of spirituality, the numinous, a sense of engagement with the earth, a sort of Anthropocene, not Holocene type concept. And one of the conversations we're having about possibly actually creating an adventure around that, but also starting to engage you in that program, because you've got a unique capability there, which is replicated in, you know, there's universities around the world with the same sort of context, but you know, we can bring those sort of things together. And I think actually the fact that you're small and new and you're in Ukraine is a peripheral country. It always has been. It was peripheral to Poland, it was peripheral to Russia. I count you as Welsh in that sense, right? The opportunity to move faster and exploit that is there. I mean, you have a deeply spiritual concept in terms of the way that you look after undergraduates, in terms of the way the church is the center of the campus. Yes, there's a logical extension to that in that you've got a physical place which actually matches the intellectual concept there. And I think the chance to actually take some of the complexity ideas and effectively lead rather than follow. The thing I've said in Latin America, I've said it in parts of Asia, I've said it in parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, or former Eastern Europe, is copying America is the bad idea. Yeah, copying an American MBA, you will never succeed because you become less good Americans rather than brilliant Ukrainians. So complexity theory and the associated anthro-complexity concepts, and actually that issue about encounter of experience of knowing things can fail, could be a unique competitive edge if you take it up.
And probably our audience is interested, like with the way of the complexity. So I do believe that some of the people who see us are really keen of studying the complexity. So what you advise for the start for our audience, what should they Google to actually to start with your classes, with Cognitive Adge programs? What is the beginning of the story?
I should probably start with some books rather than Google, but that's a prejudice of my age showing through, all right? It's kind of like, yeah, this thing opens up. You don't have to boot it up, all right? I think there are several things, all right? There's a lot of articles on our website. There's a Harvard Business Review article I wrote, which is the front cover article, which is just over a decade old, but it's still relevant. And there's a set of books you can read on our website. But there's a lot of reading around that you can do. And as I say, the website's got references on that. It's a bit eclectic because somebody said I had to create a reading list. So I bought a barcode scanner. I'm still a techie at heart, right? I've got a barcode scanner. It's a new toy. And I scanned all the barcodes on the bookshelf I've got behind my desk. So books sprawl over our house, right? So I basically scanned all the barcodes of the books because those are the ones I go back to a lot. So they're complexity textbooks, but there's also Karl Rahner's Spirit in the World because I studied that, and there's some poetry. So you can choose and match from that. But the key thing is to engage. Complexity is actually, we sometimes call it new simplicity.
Yes.
And there's a thing, if you look it up on the web, which has me considerably heavier than I am now, which was called the Children's Party Story. We all know how to manage complexity because we do it in our day-to-day lives. So one of the things we've been talking about here is starting to run some experimental programs using the anthropological software, using training, about building complexity into some of your undergraduate models and your postgraduate models, and I think that's the way to go.
And I think that the final drop is also that we are going to actually to collaborate in this field a lot. So we are trying to focus on the leadership, especially on the spiritual leadership. So I think that we will have the number of opportunities to offer together for the Ukrainian citizens and for the Ukrainian.
Yeah, and I'm particularly interested in that. And I've also discovered a new city which I've fallen in love with. So it would be great to come back.
So let me thank you for coming here. Let me thank you for your hard work, but very interesting work, actually, that gives a lot of enthusiasm. Because we are for a periphery country, for a periphery society, but also for the really dynamic society that is trying to make a difference. So let's concentrate on that. Let's develop this and do a lot of experiments. If we fail,
we fail. I look forward to it.
So thank you for coming
Thank
here,
you.
being here. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, and thank you for our Institute of Leadership Management for making it possible.
Great. Thanks.